In April of that year, a 14-year-old girl walked to a fence line in Carbon County, Montana, and told a vice president of a Denver bank that his $17 million project was going to fail. He smiled at her. He thanked her. He turned back to his folding table and the men standing around it, and he never asked her name. That is where this story begins. But to understand why it matters, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a man named Earl Drummond and a green spiral notebook and a piece of ground along the Cottonwood River that remembered things people had long since stopped trying to remember. The valley in Carbon County where the Drummond farm sat was the kind of place that most people drove through without slowing down. State road cut through the middle of it, 2 lanes, no shoulder worth speaking of. And if you were heading toward Billings, you kept your eyes on the road and your foot on the gas, and the valley was just something that passed by your window, like a thought you didn't hold on to. 300 acres of hayfield and pasture and timber. A ranch house built in 1911 with a porch that faced east, and a barn that had been leaning gently to the south for longer than anyone currently living could remember. Roy Drummond, who was 46 years old and had lived on that land his entire life, said the barn had been leaning that way before his father was born. Some things, he said, settle into their tilt and stay there. Earl Drummond had kept notebooks for 53 years. They were green spiral notebooks, the kind you could buy at any feed store or pharmacy, wide-ruled with the cardboard cover that went soft at the corners after a few weeks of being carried in a jacket pocket. He started the first one in the spring of 1971, the year he turned 32, the year he decided that what he was watching on that land was worth writing down. Not the weather exactly, not the crops exactly. Something harder to name than either of those things. The way the ground behaved. The way water moved or didn't move in places where water had no business being still. The way cattle avoided certain gates in the afternoon even when the grass beyond those gates was perfectly good. The way the killdeer nested and where and how far from the bank of the river, which changed year to year in ways that told you something about the water table if you were paying attention. He wrote it all down. Dates, measurements, observations. In the wet spring of 1974, the water came up through the low corner of the south pasture, and Earl wrote down exactly where it surfaced, and how long it stayed, and what the grass looked like for the following 3 seasons. In the dry summer of 1980, he walked the fence line between the Drummond property and the old Puit land to the north, and he pressed his boot heel into the ground at intervals and wrote down where the earth gave more than it should have. In May of 1987, the buried channel ran again, the one that had been there since before any deed in the county. The old path the river had cut and abandoned sometime in the centuries before settlement, and Earl wrote Bottomfield flooded again 3rd time in 11 years old channel running. Cattle wouldn't drink at the South Trough. When Earl had his stroke in the summer of 2022, the notebooks were stacked in a wooden crate in the loft of the barn. 53 volumes. His handwriting small and neat and consistent across all of them, as if the years had not changed the way he held a pen. Cassie had read every one. She had started reading them when she was 8 years old, sitting in the loft with the light coming through the gap in the south wall. And by the time she was 11, she had read them all at least twice. She was not a strange child. She was quiet, which people sometimes confused with strangeness, but it was not the same thing. She listened more than she talked. She watched. She had her grandfather's habit of pressing her palm flat against the earth and holding it there, not doing anything in particular, just feeling. She had inherited his habit of writing things down, and by April of that year she had been keeping her own notebooks for 6 years. The same green spiral kind stacked in the kitchen drawer, beside the one her grandfather had used for the last year of his life. The spring that year ran lower than it should have, not by much. 3 or 4 inches off the high water mark on the cottonwood at the ford, the one Earl had notched in 1973, with a belt knife and marked every year after that. Most people would not have noticed. Cassie noticed. She noticed the killdeer were nesting 20 yards farther from the bank than they had been the year before. She noticed the cattails on the south slough had thinned out in the places where they had always been thickest. She noticed the wet patch at the base of the lower pasture, the one that had been reliably wet every May since her grandfather had first written about it. In 1971, was dry on top this year, and soft underneath in a way that felt different from ordinary dryness. You could push a stick through the surface and feel nothing for the first 6 inches, and then meet something cold and yielding below something that had been moving recently and had stopped. She wrote it down. April 3rd, river 3 to 4 inches below the 1973 mark. Killdeer nesting shift roughly 20 yards north. South slough cattails sparse on the east side. Lower pasture surface, dry subsurface, wet depth, approximately 7 inches to contact. The trucks came on a Thursday in the second week of April. 3 white pickups with a logo on the door, a stylized shield with the words, Continental Trust Bank, Commercial Real Estate Division, printed beneath it in navy blue. Behind the pickups came a flatbed carrying survey equipment, and behind that, a black SUV with tinted windows that had the look of something that did not belong on a gravel road and knew it. They stopped at the fence line at the north edge of the Drummond property, where the Drummond land ended and the old Puit land began. 5,000 acres. The Puit family had sold the previous fall after the last of the brothers died, and the heirs scattered across 3 states had decided that none of them wanted to come back to Carbon County. Continental Trust had bought the parcel through its commercial division. The people at the feed store in town said the bank was planning a logistics hub on the land, some kind of agricultural processing and distribution facility, with a rail spur connection on the south end. The bank had flown people in from Denver. The bank had plans. Cassie was rinsing her breakfast bowl at the kitchen sink when she saw the trucks pull up. She stood there with the water running and watched through the window while 3 men got out and went to stand at the corner post of the Puit fence line. One of them had a tablet. One of them was pointing at the slope that ran down toward the river bottom. The river bottom where the ground went soft in May. The slope where the buried channel curved under 30 feet of silt and gravel that had been accumulating since before the state of Montana existed. Roy came in from the porch and stood beside her. He was 46 and looked older the way men who work outside look older. Not aged exactly, but weathered, the lines in his face settled into places where they belonged. He poured himself coffee and looked out the window. She set her bowl in the rack and dried her hands. "Dad," she said, "that's a bad place to build." He looked at her for a moment. He knew what she meant. He had grown up on that land. He had pressed his own palms into that ground. But he was tired in a way that had started the morning he found his father on the kitchen floor in July of 2022. And he had $800 of veterinary bills on the kitchen table that needed to be paid by the end of the month. And the number that lived at the back of his mind every waking hour was $38,000. Which was what remained of a $52,000 loan he had taken out 5 years earlier, when his father's health started failing, and the equipment needed replacing, and there was no one else to ask. The loan came due in 14 months. He had a plan for it barely. and the plan required that everything go right for the next 14 months, and things had a way of not going right. "It's not our land," he said. "The bank can do what it wants with it." She nodded. She understood. She went and got her notebook anyway. The first time she spoke to them was 3 days later. She had been walking the fence line the way she did every week, checking the wire and looking at where the soil changed color, along the peat side of the boundary. The survey crew had been working on the upper bench that morning, and now they had moved down toward the river bottom and set up a folding table near the south corner of the peat fence. A table with plans weighted down by river stones. There were 4 of them today, and a woman Cassie had not seen before. The woman noticed her first. She was maybe 40 with her hair pulled back and boots that were clean in a way that told you they were new. She had the kind of face that was accustomed to being in charge of things, not unkindly just organized. She called across the fence, "You live around here." Cassie pointed back toward the house. "Right there." The woman smiled. She introduced herself as Karen Sorrell, project manager, Continental Trust Commercial. She said they were going to be neighbors for a while. She gestured at the plans on the table and explained that they were in the early planning stages for a processing and distribution facility on the Puit parcel. Phase 1 would go down near the river bottom, she said, because that was where the rail spur connection was most efficient. "You're putting the main building down there," Cassie said. Karen looked at the plans. "The processing facility, yes. We need the rail access, and the spur line runs along the bottom corridor." Cassie was quiet for a moment. Her grandfather had taught her that when people were not listening, you only got one chance to be heard. And you had to use that chance on the right sentence, not the first sentence that came to mind. "The river doesn't stay where you think it does," she said. Karen tilted her head. She was still smiling, but the smile had shifted slightly. Become the smile you give a child who has said something that requires a polite response. "What do you mean?" "It moved twice in my grandfather's lifetime. There's a buried channel under that bottom. You can see where it was in dry years. The grass comes in different. The ground is soft a long way down, and the channel runs from the high pasture down toward our spring. Our spring comes out on the south end of our property. It's down gradient from your building site." One of the men at the table, older, wearing a fleece vest with the Continental Trust shield on the chest, looked up from his tablet. "We've got a geotechnical survey scheduled for next week," he said. "They'll be drilling test pits across the whole footprint. Appreciate the heads up." He said it kindly. That was the part that cost something. He wasn't sneering. He was being polite to a child the way adults are polite to children who have said something they consider harmless. He was doing her a favor by responding at all, and they both knew it and she knew it, and there was nothing she could say that would change what he had already decided about her. "The pits won't be in the right places," she said. "The channel curves. It doesn't run straight through." The man smiled. "We use a licensed firm out of Billings. They know what they're doing. Bank wouldn't sign off otherwise." She nodded. There wasn't anything else to say. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and walked back along the fence line. Behind her, she heard Karen say something quiet, and one of the other men made a sound not quite a laugh, just a small release of air. The kind of sound people make when something is harmless and slightly amusing and not worth the energy of a full laugh. She wrote it down that night, April 14th. Spoke to project manager Karen Sorrell and Continental Trust engineer. Informed them of buried channel and spring gradient. They noted it. They will not change the survey grid. She opened her grandfather's 1987 notebook and read the entry for May 14th of that year. Bottom field flooded again, third time in 11 years. Old channel running. Cattle wouldn't drink at the South Trough. She sat at the kitchen table for a while after that. The house was quiet. Roy had gone to bed early because he was always tired now, the kind of tired that sleep didn't entirely fix. Through the window, she could see the lights of a vehicle moving along the road that ran beside the peatland. Probably someone from the survey crew checking on equipment. She thought about the channel. She thought about the way her grandfather had walked her along the line of it the summer she was 9. The two of them moving through the tall grass of the bottom field on a July morning, and he would stop every 20 yards or so and press his boot heel into the ground. And sometimes he would crouch and put his palm flat against the earth and hold it there. He didn't explain what he was feeling for. He just showed her where to stand. He showed her where the grass was a slightly different shade of green in the dry years greener, because the roots were reaching deeper water. He showed her the line where the ground changed texture under your feet, where you went from walking on solid earth to walking on something that had more give to it, something that had been a riverbed once and remembered it. The water doesn't disappear. He told her that morning. It just goes somewhere else. Your job is to figure out where it went. She was 9 years old, and she did not entirely understand what he meant. But she understood it later reading his notebooks. She understood it the way you understand something that was always true but that you needed time to grow into. The drilling rig came on a Thursday the following week. She watched it from the fence line, keeping her distance, not trying to interfere. The geotech crew set up on the high ground first, pulling cores along the upper slope where the bedrock was close to the surface, and the results came back firm and unremarkable. Then they moved down. The engineer running the rig was a methodical man moving his drill points in a grid pattern 200 feet between each one, following the layout the bank's architects had specified. At each point on the bottom, the cores came back the same. Brown silt clay river bottom gravel, solid at 11 feet. The engineer drilled to 12 feet at each point, which was the contractual depth, and at each point he found what he expected to find. The channel curved. That was the thing. It curved through the bottom land in a long, lazy arc, like a river that had once been in no particular hurry. And the engineer's grid points were landing on either side of it without ever crossing it directly. She could see it. She knew where the arc went because she had walked it, because her grandfather had written it down and sketched the rough path of it in the margin of the 1980 notebook. In pencil, a curving line with notations at intervals about where the ground gave and where it didn't. The engineer was missing the channel laterally by 20 feet here, 30 feet there. Not because he was careless, because the grid didn't account for what wasn't in any report. She watched him work for an hour, and then walked back to the house. The town hall meeting was on a Wednesday evening in early May. It was held in the community room at the county extension office, which sat at the edge of town, on a road that had once been the main street before the state route bypassed the center. About 60 people came. Farmers, ranchers, a few people from the businesses in town. Some of them were there because they had concerns about the development. Some were there because Mitchell Vane was presenting and they had heard he was a good talker and wanted to see for themselves. Mitchell Vane was the vice president of commercial real estate for Continental Trust's regional division. He had flown in from Denver that morning. He was in his early 50s with the kind of build that had been athletic in his 30s and was now solid in a way that suggested authority rather than fitness. He wore a jacket that was the right kind of jacket for a meeting in a Montana County Extension office. Not too expensive, not too casual. Chosen carefully to signal that he was a serious person who understood the context he was operating in. He had a voice that carried without seeming to try. He had been doing this for a long time. He walked through the project with a presentation on a pull-down screen maps and renderings and projected economic figures for the county, jobs, tax revenue, infrastructure improvements. He was good at this, and the room was engaged in the way rooms get engaged when someone is telling them something they want to believe. $60 million in capital investment, 85 permanent jobs, a rail connection that would lower transport costs for every grain producer in the county. Roy sat in the third row with his hat in his hands. Cassie sat beside him. When Vane opened the floor for questions, several people spoke. A rancher from the north end of the county asked about truck traffic on County Road 12. A woman from the Chamber of Commerce asked about the construction timeline. A man from the co-op asked about water usage and the impact on the aquifer. Vane answered each question with patience and the practiced ease of someone who had answered these questions many times in many rooms. He was never dismissive. He was always specific. He had numbers for everything. Cassie stood up. She was 14 years old. She was wearing a blue flannel shirt and her good boots, and she had her notebook in her hand. The room shifted slightly when she stood the way rooms shift when something unexpected happens. A slight collective adjustment of attention. She said her name and said she lived on the farm directly to the south of the Puit Parcelle. She said she had been observing the bottomland along the river corridor for 6 years, and her grandfather had been doing the same for 53 years before that. She said there was a buried paleo channel running diagonally beneath the proposed building footprint, and that her grandfather had documented it extensively, and that the geotechnical survey grid had not been positioned to detect it. She said the channel connected subsurface to a spring on the Drummond property that was the primary water source for their stock, and that construction disturbance in the bottom could compromise that spring. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Mitchell Vane looked at her. He had the expression of a man who was genuinely trying to be fair, who wanted to give the impression of taking something seriously, even when he had already decided it required no serious response. He nodded slowly. He said he appreciated her concern, and that it was clear she cared deeply about the land her family had worked. He said Continental Trust had retained a licensed geotechnical firm with 30 years of experience in the Billings Basin, and that the survey had been conducted according to industry standards. He paused. He looked out at the room, not at Cassie, just at the room in general. And he said, "I'll make sure our engineers know to check under the fence line, too." Several people laughed, not everyone. Maybe 15 or 20 scattered through the room. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of people who found something mildly amusing, a gentle laugh, the kind that requires no particular malice. But it filled the room, and it was directed at her, and it lasted long enough to be a verdict. Roy sat very still in his chair. His hat was in both hands. His jaw was set. He did not look at Cassie, and he did not look at Vane. Cassie sat down. She wrote the date in her notebook. She wrote V told the room to check under the fence line. Room laughed. Did not ask about the 1971 notebook. Did not ask about the spring. On the drive home, Roy was quiet for a long time. The headlights swept the gravel and the dark fields on either side of the road, and somewhere out in the dark, the cottonwood ran lower than it should have. "You didn't have to do that," he said finally. She looked out the window. She knew what he meant. He meant that she had put herself in front of 60 people and been laughed at, and that he had been sitting 3 rows back when it happened, and that there was a version of this night where she had kept her notebook in her lap and let the man from Denver say his piece, and let the room fill up with those $60 million in projected investment, and just gone home, and none of this had been her problem. She understood why he would want that version. She understood what it cost him to sit in that room. She did not tell him about the water rights claim. Not that night. She had found it 3 days earlier on a Tuesday afternoon at the county clerk's office in town. She had gone in after school to look at the original survey records for the Puit Parcel property descriptions and water allocations, the kind of documentation that nobody much looked at unless they were buying or selling or had a particular reason to pay attention. The clerk was a woman named Doris, who had been in that office for 22 years and who knew Cassie's family, and did not ask why a 14-year-old was looking at water allocation records. Because Doris had been around long enough to understand that sometimes the people who showed up to look at things were exactly the people who needed to be looking. The filing was straightforward on its face. Continental Trust Bank, Commercial Real Estate Division, had submitted an application for water rights on the seasonal creek that ran along the northern edge of the Puit Parcel. The creek was named Sorensen Creek on the original survey maps, a tributary of the Cottonwood, and it ran across the northeastern corner of the Puetland before turning south and feeding into the aquifer that supplied, among other things, the spring on the south end of the Drummond property. The claim, if approved, would give the bank priority water rights on Sorensen Creek in perpetuity. It was a standard commercial filing. It was the kind of thing that happened all the time in water-scarce counties when large development projects came in, companies securing their resource base before construction began. The clerk at the state engineer's office had stamped it, received, and placed it in the queue. What it meant in practical terms was this: if Continental Trust's water rights claim was approved, and if the development went forward and the bank drew on those rights at the commercial scale, a facility of that size would require the flow into the aquifer that fed the Drummond Spring could be reduced. Not immediately. Not dramatically, perhaps. But over time, in dry years, the kind of dry years that were becoming more common and that Earl Drummond had written about with increasing frequency in his notebooks from the 1980s, onward the spring could slow. It could fail. Without the spring, the Drummond cattle had no reliable water source in the south pasture. Without water in the south pasture, Roy would have to reconfigure his grazing rotation, which would reduce the carrying capacity of the land, which would reduce his herd, which would reduce his revenue, which would make it very difficult to service a $38,000 loan that came due in 14 months. She had not told Roy about it because he had enough to carry. She wrote it down in her notebook instead and sat with it for 3 days and thought about what it meant. That night, after the town hall meeting, after Roy had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the light on and opened her grandfather's 1971 notebook. It was the first one, the edges worn soft and the cover faded from green to something closer to gray, and the handwriting inside was younger than the handwriting in the later volumes, a little less settled, still finding its size and slope. In the entry for May 22nd, 1971, Earl had written, "Walk the south bottom today. Ground gives along the east line of the Puit fence, maybe 30 yards in from the corner post. Press down 2 feet with a steel rod and hit water. Ran a line from that point along the curve and marked it with stakes. This is the old channel. It runs from the northeast, comes in at an angle about 40 degrees off the fence line. Anybody builds down there someday, they want to know about this first. Anybody builds down there someday." She read that sentence twice. She looked at the date. May 22nd, 1971. 53 years ago, her grandfather had walked that ground and pressed a steel rod into it and come home and written that sentence in a green notebook that sat in a wooden crate in a barn loft for half a century. He had known. He had written it down because he believed that what you knew, if you wrote it down carefully enough, would still be there when someone needed it. She was starting to understand that she was the someone. She turned to a fresh page in her own notebook and wrote the date. Then she wrote Grandpa knew in 1971. I know now. The question is whether the knowing is enough. She sat for a while longer. Outside the window, the dark was complete, no moon, and the valley was quiet except for the sound of the creek that ran along the east edge of the property. Lower than it should have been by 3 or 4 inches, steady and indifferent in its bed. She thought about the night she had spent in the loft, the year after her grandfather died, reading the last notebook, the one from 2021 and 2022. The entries getting shorter as the year went on, and his handwriting changing in ways she recognized now as the early signs of what had been coming. He had kept writing even when it was hard. The last entry was dated June 3rd, 2022, 6 weeks before his stroke, and it said only river running good. Killdeer back in the south corner. 51 years of this, and the ground still tells you things if you're willing to hear it. She closed the notebook. She turned off the kitchen light. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the dark shape of the Puit land to the north, 5,000 acres of it, and beyond it somewhere the lights of the survey crew's equipment trailer, a faint orange glow at the edge of the dark. The drilling was done. The cores were bagged and labeled. The engineer from the Billings firm had found what the grid told him to find, which was solid ground at 11 feet and clean samples at every test point, none of which had been positioned on the buried channel, because no one with a grid and a contract had thought to ask where the channel curved. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the creek. In the morning, she got up before Roy and made coffee and stood on the porch in the cold and watched the mist move out of the low places along the river bottom, the way it did every spring morning, slow and deliberate, like something that knew where it was going. Her grandfather used to stand on this porch in the early morning. He said the valley remembered things that people forgot. He said the land kept records, and if you watched long enough, you learned to read them. She had been watching. She had been reading. She went inside and got her notebook and sat at the kitchen table and wrote down what she saw. May 4th. Mist distribution heavier in the northwest quadrant of the bottom than the southeast. This is new. Ground moisture pattern has shifted since they pulled the topsoil on the upper bench last week. Water table may be responding. Will monitor. She kept writing. That was what you did. You kept writing and you kept watching and you trusted that the ground would tell you the truth, even when no one else was interested in hearing it. The trucks would come back. The engineers would come back. The plans would go forward. And the channel would be there exactly where it had always been, exactly where Earl Drummond had pressed his boot heel into the soft earth in May of 1971 and written down what he found. 53 years of notebooks stacked in a wooden crate in the loft of a leaning barn, waiting for the moment when what they contained would matter. That moment was coming. Cassie did not know exactly when or exactly how, but she had been reading the land long enough to know that it was coming the way water comes, not by force, not all at once, but steadily along the path of least resistance, finding its way to exactly where it intended to go. They broke ground on a Monday in the second week of June. Cassie heard the excavators before she saw them. A low diesel rumble that came through the bedroom window before 6 in the morning and sat in the air like weather. She was already awake. She had been awake for a while, lying in the gray light listening to the creek, which was running lower now than it had been in April, and lower than any June her notebooks recorded going back to 2018. She got up and dressed and went out to the porch with her coffee and watched the lights of the equipment moving on the Puit land to the north, orange and white. in the early dark, slow and deliberate the way heavy machines move when they are about to do something irreversible. Roy came out behind her. He stood for a moment without speaking, both of them watching the lights. He said he had called the bank about the water rights claim. She looked at him. He said he had found the filing himself 2 days after she did. He had not said anything because he wanted to understand it first. And then he had called the bank's commercial office in Billings and spoken to a woman there who told him the filing was standard procedure for projects of this scale, and that the claim was still pending state review, and that if he had concerns, he could submit a comment during the public notice period, which had closed in March. The public notice period had closed in March, before the town hall, before the presentation, before Mitchell Vane had stood in front of 60 people and talked about economic impact. Roy wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He said it was probably nothing. He said water rights claims got filed and challenged and modified all the time in this state, and that most of them never amounted to what they looked like on paper. Cassie nodded. She did not say that she had been watching the creek levels for 2 months. She did not say that the aquifer recharge pattern had already shifted since the upper bench grading began. She had written it down, and she would keep writing it down, and she would wait for the ground to tell the rest of the story in its own time, because that was the only language anyone in a position of authority seemed to understand. The graders worked through June. They peeled the topsoil off the building footprint in long, efficient passes, pushing it into berms along the eastern edge of the site, where it sat in dark rows, the top 12 inches of bottomland that had been accumulating since the river changed course. Exposed now to the sun and the wind and the occasional afternoon rain that came through in July without committing to anything. The excavators followed, digging the foundation pad 8 feet down on the riverside, 6 on the high side, working from the northeast corner toward the southwest in the sequence the engineers had specified. On the 14th of June, they hit water at 6 feet on the riverside of the cut. Not a lot. A seep. A darkening in the wall of the excavation. A thin glaze of moisture that appeared between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon and ran to the bottom of the cut and pooled there. The foreman called Carl Briggs, who drove out from Billings the next morning, and looked at it and took readings and told the foreman it was within tolerance. Groundwater in a river bottom was expected. They would lay a drainage course under the slab and a vapor barrier and proceed. The foreman, who had built things in a lot of river bottom country, agreed. The bank's project office in Denver reviewed the variance request the same afternoon and signed off by 4 o'clock. Cassie watched from the fence line that afternoon. She watched Briggs walk the cut with a clipboard. She watched him take his readings. She watched him get back in his truck and drive away. She went home and opened her notebook and wrote June 15th. Water at 6 feet in the northeast cut. Briggs called it within tolerance. Drainage course proposed. This is exactly where Grandpa's 1974 entry said water would surface. She opened the 1974 notebook and found the entry. June 12th, 1974. North end of the bottom water came up in the low corner at about 5.5 feet when we dug for the post anchor on the Puit fence. Ran clear. This is the channel margin. 10 yards north it would have been deeper and faster. 10 yards north. The bank's northeast excavation corner was approximately 10 yards north of the old fence line post position her grandfather had noted. She measured it on the county parcel map that night, using a ruler and the scale printed in the corner. 11 yards. The seep Briggs had called within tolerance was sitting almost exactly on the margin her grandfather had identified 50 years earlier, with a belt knife and a post hole digger and a notebook. She wrote, "They are building on the margin. The center is still ahead of them. The footings were poured on a Wednesday in the third week of June. The slab followed on a Tuesday in early July. She watched the concrete trucks come and go, 7 of them over the course of the day, and she watched the finishing crew work the surface in the late afternoon heat. The slab was gray and smooth, and looked from where she stood at the fence like something that would be there forever. Her grandfather had a word for that. He called it the confidence of the uninformed. He meant it without cruelty. He just meant that people who had not watched a piece of ground long enough sometimes built things on it with a certainty that the ground had not given them permission for. July passed. The hay came off the upper field, and Roy got a decent price for it, better than last year. And he paid the vet bills and set the rest against the loan. The number in his notebook dropped from 38,000 to 31. He did not say anything about it, but Cassie saw him sitting with his ledger one evening in a way that was slightly different from the way he usually sat with it. The set of his shoulders a fraction less held, and she understood that the hay had helped. The steel went up in August. It came in on flatbeds over the course of 4 days. The framing crew working fast in the August heat. The columns going up and the beams going across. And the structure taking shape above the river bottom in a way that changed the look of the valley. You could see it from the porch now. You could see it from the road. It rose out of the bottom land like something that had decided to be permanent. The first hairline crack appeared on August 22nd. Cassie noticed it on the morning of the 23rd, walking the fence line on her usual route. She had to look carefully to see it from her side of the fence. It ran across the northeast corner of the slab, starting about 4 feet from the east wall anchor, and running southwest for roughly 12 feet, before fading to nothing. The width of it from where she stood was less than a 1/4 inch. A finishing crew would have looked at it and written it down as within tolerance and moved on. She wrote down the direction, the approximate length, the location relative to the anchor bolt pattern. She noted that it ran on the river side of the building footprint. She noted that it ran perpendicular to the direction a crack from standard curing shrinkage would be expected to run. She went home and looked at her grandfather's 1971 sketch. The crack ran approximately parallel to the curve of the buried channel. It ran along the margin where solid ground met the permeable alluvium that filled the old riverbed. The slab was settling, not uniformly. The northeast corner, which sat over the deepest part of the channel, was settling slightly faster than the rest. She wrote August 23rd. First crack. Northeast corner 12 feet. 1/4 inch riverside. Parallel to channel margin per 1971 sketch. Differential settlement beginning. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. She had told them in April, and they had checked under the fence line. She had told them at the town hall, and the room had laughed. She had submitted a written comment to the county planning office in May, outlining the subsurface conditions and the potential impact on the Drummond Spring, and the planning office had forwarded it to the bank's project engineer. And the bank's project engineer had responded with a 1-page letter, noting that all required surveys had been completed and approved, and that no further action was warranted. She kept writing. The second crack appeared in September. It ran from the first crack south, adding 18 feet to the network, widening the original to nearly 3/8 of an inch at the widest point. A third crack branched off the second shorter, running toward the loading dock foundation on the south wall. The 3 of them formed a rough pattern on the river side of the building, all running the same general direction, all on the side of the slab that was directly above where Cassie knew the channel to be deepest. The bank's engineers came back in September. She could see them from the fence, walking the perimeter, crouching to look at the cracks. There were 2 of them she had not seen before, younger, with equipment she did not recognize. They walked the building for 2 hours. She watched the whole thing from the fence line. At one point, one of them, a young woman with her hair pulled back, stopped at the northeast corner and stood very still for a long time, looking at the crack, and then looked out toward the river, and then back at the crack, and then walked the perimeter again more slowly. That evening, Cassie wrote September 14th. 2 new engineers on site. The woman looked at the northeast crack for a long time. She knows something. The cladding went up in October. The building began to look finished from the outside, even as the engineers continued their consultations inside, and the construction activity on the site slowed to the particular pace of a project that has encountered a problem that no one has officially acknowledged yet. Trucks came and went, but not on a schedule. The foreman spent a lot of time on his phone. Cassie was coming home from school on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of October when she saw that the cattle at the South Trough were not drinking. The South Trough was a galvanized tank fed by a gravity line from the spring at the base of the slope. The spring had run clean and cold her entire life, cold enough in July that the cattle preferred it to the creek, which went tepid in the heat. Now the cattle were standing around the trough and not drinking. 4 of them had turned away from it entirely and were standing near the gate looking toward the creek, which was 40 yards north and lower than it should have been. She went to the trough and looked at the water. It looked clear. She cupped her hand and brought some to her nose. There was something. Faint. Metallic, like the smell of a freshly turned bolt or like the water in a stock tank that had gone a little wrong, except that this was the spring, and the spring did not go wrong. She went and got Roy. He came out and looked at it and crouched beside the trough and smelled the water, and then tasted a small amount from his palm and spat it out. He stood up. He looked at the cattle standing by the gate. He looked at the trough. He did not say anything for a long time. He said he would call the county extension office in the morning. She went inside and wrote October 21st. South Trough. Cattle refusing water. Metallic smell faint but present. Spring has changed. The extension office sent someone out 2 days later. A man named Garrett, who had been with the county for 12 years. And who took 3 water samples from the trough, 2 from the spring head at the base of the slope, and 1 from the creek for comparison. He put them in sealed containers and sent them to the state lab in Billings. He told Roy it would take 10 to 14 days for results. Roy nodded. He asked Garrett what he thought off the record. Garrett looked at the samples and looked at the construction site visible to the north and said he thought they would want to read the results before drawing conclusions. The results came back in early November. Roy read the report twice at the kitchen table and then went out and stood on the porch. Cassie picked up the paper and read it herself. Elevated turbidity. Trace petroleum compounds consistent with construction lubricants or hydraulic fluid. Suspended sediment fine-grained consistent with disturbed alluvial material from an upstream source. The lab notation at the bottom said, results suggest contamination from an active disturbance event in the upstream aquifer. Recommend investigation of potential source. Upstream. The spring sat at the toe of the slope down gradient from the Continental Trust building site by approximately 300 yards, connected to it through the buried channel through the permeable alluvium that filled the old riverbed, through the groundwater that moved the way. Water always moved not by the routes that appeared on any construction map, but by the routes the earth had made for it over thousands of years. She stood at the screen door and looked at Roy on the porch. He was standing with his arms at his sides, looking out at nothing in particular, the way a man stands when something has happened that he was afraid was going to happen. and that he is now absorbing. She went out and stood beside him. After a while, he said to get her notebook. They drove into town that afternoon. Roy had an appointment with the county extension office and then with the county health department, and he wanted the notebooks with him. Specifically, the ones from 1971 and 1987, and the current one, the three that most clearly documented the subsurface conditions and the spring's behavior over time. He carried them under his arm when they went in. He was quiet in the way he was when he was deciding things. The extension office told them to document everything, dates and water levels and any changes in the cattle, and to submit a formal complaint to the Department of Environmental Quality, which had jurisdiction over aquifer contamination events. The health department said much the same thing and gave them a form. Roy filled out the form at the counter. Cassie watched him write in his careful, slightly labored handwriting, the handwriting of a man who did not write often, but who was precise when he did. On the way home, he said, "This is going to get complicated." She looked out the window at the fields going by in the early dark. He said $31,000 and the spring going bad, and 14 months. That's where we are. She said she knew. He said nothing else. She said nothing else. The road ran straight, and the headlights lit the gravel ahead of them, and somewhere to the north, visible over the tree line, the lights of the Continental Trust building sat in the dark like something that did not know yet what it had done. The letter arrived on a Monday morning in the second week of November. It came in a business envelope with the Continental Trust logo in the upper left corner, addressed to Roy Drummond, and Roy opened it at the kitchen table with his coffee, and read it without changing expression, and then read it again, and then set it down. He pushed it across the table to Cassie. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph stated that Continental Trust had retained an environmental consulting firm to investigate conditions at the Phase 1 construction site and in the surrounding area. The second paragraph stated that the preliminary findings of that investigation suggested the presence of legacy agricultural runoff contamination in the downstream aquifer, consistent with unmaintained drainage infrastructure on adjacent private property, and that the bank was evaluating its legal options with respect to damages incurred. The third paragraph said that the bank trusted the Drummond family would cooperate with the ongoing investigation, and that further communication would follow. Legacy agricultural runoff, unmaintained drainage infrastructure on adjacent private property. She read it twice. She understood what it was. It was not a lawsuit. It was a warning, a position being established on paper. Before positions needed to be defended, a way of putting a flag in the ground that said, if this goes somewhere, we were not the ones who started it. It was the move of people who had resources and lawyers, and who knew that the first thing you did when a problem surfaced was make sure the problem had someone else's name on it. She looked at Roy. His face was the same as it had been when he first read it. No expression she could name, just the face of a man doing the arithmetic of a situation he had not anticipated. He was calculating. She could almost see it happening, the numbers running behind his eyes. 31,000, 14 months, a spring that was failing. A letter from a bank that had enough lawyers to make the next 2 years of his life very expensive, even if he was right about everything. He said, "I need to call someone." She said, "I know." He picked up the letter and looked at it again. Then he put it down and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand and looked at the ceiling for a moment. And when he looked back down, his eyes were tired in a way that was different from the ordinary tiredness, a deeper kind. The kind that comes when something you have been quietly afraid of for a long time has finally arrived. He said, "We might lose this place, Cass." She had known it was possible. She had known it the way you know things that you do not let yourself fully think, because the thinking of them is its own kind of damage. But to hear him say it in that voice, in that kitchen with the notebooks stacked on the counter and the letter on the table between them, was different from knowing it. She felt it move through her the way cold moves through a room when a door opens sudden and total. She did not say anything. She looked at the table. Her eyes filled and she let them, because there was no point in not letting them. And Roy reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, just briefly, and then took it back and picked up his coffee cup. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She picked up her notebook and wrote the date and wrote "Letter from Continental Trust, Legacy Runoff, Unmaintained Drainage. They are going to say it was us." She underlined the last sentence. Then she opened the 1971 notebook to the May 22nd entry and read her grandfather's words again. "Old channel, soft to 40 feet. Anybody builds down there someday, they want to know about this first." She kept it open on the table beside her current notebook and looked at both of them for a while. Roy made calls that afternoon. He reached a lawyer in Billings who did agricultural and water rights work. A woman named Clara Voss, who had been recommended by a rancher Roy knew from the co-op, and Clara told him to gather everything. Every notebook, every lab report, every piece of correspondence with the bank. Going back to the first day the trucks showed up, and to send it all to her, and she would review it and call him by the end of the week. He came back from the phone and told Cassie what Clara had said about the notebooks. Cassie was already stacking them on the kitchen table, 53 volumes of Green Spiral, in chronological order. She said she knew. He looked at the stack. He did not say anything about it. He went out to check on the cattle. She began making a list of the entries that were directly relevant, every notation about the buried channel. Every entry about the spring. Every observation about water table behavior in the bottom pasture. She worked for 2 hours. The list filled 4 pages in her current notebook. She wrote dates and volume numbers and page references across indexed record of 53 years of observation, pointing at a single conclusion that the bank's engineers had been positioned to miss, and that its lawyers were now trying to point away from. The call from Clara Voss came on a Friday. Cassie was home from school, and Roy took it in the kitchen. And she sat on the far side of the room and listened to half of it. Clara had reviewed the materials Roy had sent, the lab report and the bank's letter, and a summary of the fence line conversation from April and the town hall from May. She said the letter was a standard defensive positioning document, and that it did not necessarily mean litigation was coming, but that they needed to be prepared for that possibility. She said the notebooks were potentially significant. She said the key question was whether there was any documentation establishing the subsurface conditions before construction began, documentation that could demonstrate the bank had access to information suggesting risk and had proceeded anyway. Roy looked at Cassie. She was already pointing at the 1971 notebook on the table. He told Clara about the notebooks. He told her about the fence line conversation in April. He told her about the town hall. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to see the notebooks, specifically the ones from 1971 and 1987, and anything from the period when the survey was being conducted. And she wanted a written account of the April fence line conversation, names, dates, what was said. Roy said his daughter had written all of it down. Clara said, "Good. Keep her writing." 3 days later, on a Monday, Roy got a call he was not expecting. He had gone out to work on the hay equipment in the shop, getting ahead of the winter maintenance, and Cassie was at the kitchen table doing homework when the phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize, a Billings area code, but not a number in their contacts. She answered it. The voice was a woman's, professional but slightly careful. The way a voice sounds when the person speaking is choosing her words in real time, because she is not entirely sure what she is allowed to say. She asked if this was the Drummond residence. She said her name was Nora Tesh. She said she was a geotechnical engineer, and that she had recently been involved in the survey work on the Continental Trust project site, adjacent to the Drummond property. She said she was calling because she had information she believed was relevant to the contamination situation, and that she had not been comfortable with how that information had been handled internally. Cassie said, "I'm Roy Drummond's daughter. He's in the shop." "Can I get him?" Nora Tesh said. "Actually, you're the one I was hoping to speak to. Are you the one who came to the fence line in April and told Karen Sorrell about the buried channel?" Cassie said yes. There was a pause. Then Nora said, "You were right. I want you to know that. I ran my own analysis after the settlement issues started appearing in August. I pulled historical aerial photographs going back to 1954. I mapped the subsurface conditions using the core samples in combination with archival soil survey data. The channel is real. It runs exactly where you said it does. And the test grid we were given did not cross it because it was oriented at an angle that missed the curve. I found this in August. I documented it and submitted it to Carl Briggs as a supplementary finding." Cassie wrote the name Carl Briggs in her notebook. She wrote the date. Nora said my findings were removed from the official report summary that went to the bank's project office. I was told the channel was outside the scope of the contracted survey. I was told the variance had already been approved and that additional findings would create unnecessary complications. Cassie said, "Do you still have the original report?" Nora said she did. Cassie said, "Will you talk to our lawyer?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would. She said she was not doing it lightly. She said she had been in this field for 9 years, and she knew what it meant to contradict a senior engineer on a project with a major institutional client. But she said she had a particular problem with the contamination letter the bank had sent to the Drummond family because she had seen the conditions on that site, and she knew exactly how the contamination had traveled through the subsurface, and it had nothing to do with legacy, agricultural runoff from the Drummond property. Cassie wrote Nora Tesh. Original report exists. Channel confirmed independent. Ready to talk to Clara Voss. She said, "Thank you, Miss Tesh. Nora said you said it first in April. I just had the instruments to prove it." After she hung up, Cassie sat very still for a moment. She looked at the notebooks on the table. She looked at the list of entries she had compiled, 4 pages of cross-referenced dates and observations. She thought about her grandfather pressing his boot heel into the soft earth in May of 1971 and writing down what he found. She thought about what it meant that a woman with a graduate degree in geotechnical instruments had arrived at the same conclusion by a different route and had been told to remove it from the record. She thought about how the ground did not change its answer. When you told it, you did not like what it was saying. It just kept being what it was soft, where it was soft, wet, where it was wet, shaped by processes that had been running for centuries before anyone came with a grid and a clipboard and a 12-foot drill. She got up and went to the door of the shop and told Roy he needed to come in. He came in with grease on his hands and looked at her face. She told him about the call. She told him about Nora Tesh and the original report and what had been removed from it. She told him what Nora had said about the contamination and about the bank's letter. Roy stood in the kitchen with grease on his hands and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. He looked at the notebooks on the table. He looked at the list she had made. He said, "Call Clara Voss." She was already dialing. Outside, the valley was going toward winter. The light changing the way it changed in November, lower and flatter, and the river running in its bed, reduced but steady, and the Continental Trust building on the Puet land standing in the afternoon light, with 3 visible cracks in its northeast slab, and its cladding half on, and its interior stalled at the framing stage, and its engineers in consultation, and its lawyers composing letters, and beneath all of it, running through the permeable alluvium in the long, slow arc that Earl Drummond had first marked with stakes in the spring of 1971. The buried channel moved where it had always moved and would move long after everything built above it was gone. The December meeting was held on a Thursday morning at the county extension office, the same building where Mitchell Vane had stood 4 months earlier and told the room to check under the fence line. The parking lot had 6 vehicles in it when Roy and Cassie arrived, including a state truck with the Department of Environmental Quality seal on the door and a rental sedan that had the look of something driven in from an airport. They went in together, Roy carrying the wooden crate with the notebooks, and Cassie carrying her own current volume and the folder Clara Voss had asked her to prepare, the cross-indexed list of entries with dates and page references, 4 pages in her careful handwriting. Clara met them in the hallway. She was in her late 40s, compact and direct, with the manner of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where she was the only person who had read everything. She shook Roy's hand and then looked at Cassie and said she had read the entry list and it was exactly what they needed, and to let her handle the sequencing of how it came in. The room held a long folding table and 8 chairs. Karen Sorrell was already seated in the same kind of clean boots she had been wearing at the fence line in April, but her face was different now. The professional composure still present, but sitting over something that was working against it. Carl Briggs was beside her, looking at his hands. A man from the DEQ named Patterson sat across from them with a manila folder open in front of him, and the particular expression of a state official who has been called to a meeting he did not initiate and intends to listen before he speaks. There was a man from the county commissioner's office, and at the far end of the table, in a chair slightly apart from the others, sat a man Cassie had not seen before. He was in his early 60s with gray at his temples, and the kind of stillness that came from being senior enough that he no longer needed to signal anything to anyone in the room. He was wearing a jacket that was better than Vane's had been, but worn with less awareness of itself. He introduced himself when they sat down. His name was Frank Alderman. He was the regional vice president for Continental Trust's Western Division. He said he had flown in from Denver the previous afternoon. Clara nodded at him and opened her folder. The meeting began with Patterson from the DEQ presenting the lab results, the November report, and a follow-up sample that had been taken from the Drummond Spring the previous week. The follow-up showed the same elevated turbidity and trace petroleum compounds as the first, with the addition of a measurable increase in suspended fine sediment. Patterson said the data was consistent with an ongoing subsurface disturbance event, and that the department had formally opened an investigation into the contamination source. Carl Briggs shifted in his chair. Karen Sorrell looked at the table. Clara said she wanted to enter into the record a document prepared by an independent geotechnical engineer who had been involved in the original site survey. She slid copies across the table. The document was Nora Tesch's supplementary report, the original version, the one that had been submitted to Briggs in August and removed from the official summary. It was 42 pages with maps and cross-sections and annotated core sample photographs. It identified the buried paleo channel in precise terms, its orientation, its depth profile, its composition, and its hydrological connection to the Drummond Spring on the downgradient property to the south. Briggs looked at the document and did not pick it up. Clara said, "I would like to note for the record that this report was submitted internally by the engineer who produced it in August of this year, following the appearance of settlement cracking in the Phase 1 slab, and that it was removed from the official summary provided to the bank's project office. I would also like to note that the contamination letter sent to the Drummond family on November 14th, attributing the aquifer disruption to legacy agricultural runoff from the Drummond property, was sent after this report existed, and after Carl Briggs had read it. Patterson wrote something in his folder. Frank Alderman had not moved. He was looking at the test report with an expression that was not surprise. Cassie watched him and understood that he had already read it, that he had come from Denver, because someone had put this document in front of him, and he had gotten on a plane. He had the look of a man doing damage assessment, not discovery. Clara said she also wanted to enter into the record the prior notification that the Drummond family had provided to Continental Trust representatives regarding the subsurface conditions. She read from her notes. April 14th. Fence line conversation with Karen Sorrell and Continental Trust personnel, in which Cassie Drummond, aged 14, identified the buried channel, described its orientation and its hydrological relationship to the Drummond Spring, and expressed concern that the geotechnical survey grid was not positioned to detect it. May 7th Town Hall meeting in which the same information was presented publicly by Cassie Drummond to the assembled community, and to Mitchell Vane, Vice President of Commercial Real Estate, who responded without requesting any additional investigation. Karen Sorrell looked at Cassie. It was the first time she had looked at her since they sat down. Clara said the Drummond family also submitted a written comment to the County Planning Office on May 19th, which was forwarded to the project engineer. The response, dated May 23rd, stated that all required surveys had been completed and that no further action was warranted. Briggs picked up his water glass and set it back down without drinking. Patterson said he had some questions about the survey methodology. He looked at Briggs. He asked whether the grid spacing and orientation of the test pits had been determined by the project architect or by the geotechnical firm. Briggs said it had been a collaborative determination. Patterson asked whether the grid had been reviewed against historical aerial photography or archival soil survey data prior to finalization. Briggs said the survey had been conducted according to industry standard practice. Patterson wrote something else in his folder and asked the question again more specifically. Briggs said no. Frank Alderman turned one page of the test report and then turned it back. Clara said she would now like to enter into the record the primary documentation supporting the Drummond family's prior knowledge of the subsurface conditions. She looked at Cassie. This was the moment Clara had explained to her the night before on the phone, when they had gone through the sequence of how the meeting would run. Clara had said, "You carry it in. You put it on the table. Nobody asked you to bring it, and nobody is expecting it, and that matters. It matters that it comes from you." Cassie reached into the crate and took out the 1971 notebook. She set it on the table in front of her. The cover was faded to gray, and the corners were soft, and the wire spiral was slightly bent on the bottom end from 53 years of being stacked and unstacked, and carried in jacket pockets and set down on barn floors and kitchen tables. She opened it to the May 22nd entry and laid it flat so that the people across the table could see it. She said, "This is my grandfather Earl Drummond's field notebook from 1971. He kept notebooks like this for 53 years. This is the first one. She read the May 22nd entry aloud. She read it in the same measured way her grandfather had written it, without emphasis, just the facts and what they meant. Old Channel. Soft to 40 feet. The curve from the northeast at approximately 40 degrees off the fence line. And the last sentence: anybody builds down there someday, they want to know about this first. The room was quiet. She turned to the margin of the same page. In pencil, faded but legible, her grandfather had made a sketch. It was perhaps 4 inches by 3 inches, drawn freehand, and it showed the outline of the bottom pasture and the fence line, and running through the middle of it in a long curving arc, a line marked with the notation, "Old River soft to 40 plus, do not build." The arc curved from the northeast corner of the sketch to the southwest, in exactly the shape that Nora Tesh's professional analysis had identified 53 years later. With instruments in aerial photography and graduate-level hydrology, she turned the notebook so that Frank Alderman could see the sketch clearly. He leaned forward slightly. He looked at the sketch for a long time. He looked at the date at the top of the entry, 1971. He looked at the sketch again. Patterson said quietly, "May I see that?" She passed the notebook to him. He held it carefully, the way people hold things that are old and that they understand to be significant. He looked at the sketch. He looked at the Tesh report open on the table in front of him. The professional map with its GPS coordinates and its color-coded subsurface layers and its scale bar in the corner. He placed the 2 documents side by side. The curves matched. The orientation matched. The depth notations matched within the margin of what 53 years of memory in a piece of ground could be expected to maintain. Clara said the Drummond family has 53 volumes of observation documenting this property and the adjacent land. The channel and its associated subsurface behavior appear in the record from 1971 onward, with notations in 1974, 1980, 1987, 1993, 2002, 2009, and 2017. The spring's behavior and its relationship to upstream aquifer conditions appears in 31 separate entries across 12 notebooks. This is not a claim made in response to a construction event. This is 53 years of prior knowledge in writing with dates. Karen Sorrell put her hands in her lap. She was looking at the 1971 notebook in Patterson's hands with an expression that was not quite what Cassie had expected. It was not defensive. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has just understood the full shape of something they had only seen part of before, and who is not yet sure what to do with the understanding. Frank Alderman said, "Miss Drummond." Cassie looked at him. He said, "How old were you when you first read these notebooks?" She said, 8. The first time through. I finished all of them by the time I was 11. He said, "And you had read the 1971 entry before you came to the fence line in April?" She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Carl Briggs. He looked at Karen Sorrell. His expression did not change, but something in the quality of his stillness changed the way the quality of silence in a room changes when the person with the most authority in it has arrived at a conclusion. He said, "Carl, did you receive a supplementary finding from your engineering team in August identifying a subsurface feature in the northeast quadrant of the building footprint?" Briggs said the finding was outside the scope of the contracted survey. Alderman said, "That is not what I asked." The room was very quiet. Briggs said yes. Alderman said, And was that finding communicated to the project office before the variance approval for the foundation drainage course? Briggs looked at the table. He said no. Alderman closed the test report. He set it squarely in front of him. He looked at the wall for a moment, and then back at the table, and he said nothing else. He did not need to say anything else. The arithmetic of the situation was now fully visible to everyone in the room, and it did not require narration. Patterson said the department would be issuing a formal remediation order. He said the order would require Continental Trust to commission a full hydrogeological study of the affected aquifer system, to fund all remediation necessary to restore the Drummond Spring to its pre-construction condition, and to demonstrate through ongoing monitoring that the contamination had been fully addressed. He said the process would take a minimum of 18 months, and more likely 2 to 3 years depending on what the hydrogeological study found. He said the department would also be reviewing the water rights claim filed by Continental Trust on Sorensen Creek in light of the contamination findings and the demonstrated hydrological relationship between the creek, the aquifer, and the Drummond Spring. He said it was the department's preliminary view that the claim as filed was inconsistent with the existing water rights of the downstream property owner, and that it would likely be denied. Clara said she also expected the bank to withdraw the November letter, attributing the contamination to the Drummond property in writing, and to provide a settlement covering the Drummond family's documented losses from the spring contamination, their legal costs, and the diminished carrying capacity of the south pasture over the affected period. Alderman said that would be arranged. He said it simply without negotiation, the way a man says something, when he has already done the calculation and knows what the number has to be. Clara wrote a figure on a notepad and slid it across to him. He looked at it. He wrote a slightly higher figure beside it and slid it back. Clara looked at Roy. Roy looked at the table for a moment and then nodded. Alderman said the letter will be formally withdrawn and retracted by end of business tomorrow. He said it to Roy, not to Clara. He looked at Roy the way men look at each other when they are closing something that should not have been opened. And Roy looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and can feel the weight beginning to shift. Briggs and Karen Sorrell left together without saying much. Patterson gathered his folder and shook hands with Clara and with Roy, and then looked at Cassie and said that in his experience the DEQ did not often encounter prior documentation of this quality, and that the notebooks would be formally referenced in the investigation record. She thanked him. She picked up the 1971 notebook from where it had been sitting on the table and held it in both hands for a moment before putting it back in the crate. Frank Alderman was still in his chair. When it was just him and Roy and Cassie and Clara remaining in the room, he asked if they would sit for a few more minutes. Clara looked at Roy and Roy said yes. Alderman said he wanted to be direct. He said the bank's position as it had been managed at the project level was indefensible and that he was not going to defend it. He said Mitchell Vane had operated with a degree of certainty about this project that had not been warranted by what was actually known about the site, and that when the supplementary findings came in from Briggs's team in August, the decision to set them aside had been made by Vane without escalation to regional oversight, and that this had been a serious error of judgment for which the bank would be accountable. He paused. He said, "Mr. Drummond, your daughter told us in April what we needed to know. I want to say that plainly. What happened after that is on us, not on her." Roy looked at his hat, which was on the table in front of him. He said Mitchell Vane told 60 people in this building to check under the fence line. My daughter was 14 years old. Alderman said, "I know." Roy picked up his hat. He did not say anything else. He stood up and shook Alderman's hand briefly and walked to the door to wait while Clara gathered her papers. Cassie stayed at the table for a moment. She looked at Alderman. He was the kind of man, she thought, who had been in a lot of rooms like this one rooms where something had gone wrong and someone had to determine the shape of it and figure out what came next. He did not look like a man who enjoyed this particular room. She said, "The bottom land. What happens to it now?" He said the Phase 1 building would have to be redesigned or relocated. The slab would be removed. The structural engineers had already determined that remediation of the existing foundation was not cost-effective. The new site plan would move the facility to the upper bench north of the buried channel's path, on ground that the geotechnical data supported, she said, and the bottom itself. He looked at her. He said, "What would you want to happen to it?" She thought about this. She said nothing. "It should just stay the way it is." He said he thought that was probably what would happen. He said the bank had limited appetite for further construction liability on that parcel, and that the bottom land was unlikely to be developed in any scenario he could foresee. He said he would see that it was addressed in the revised site plan. She nodded. She picked up the crate and carried it to the door. He said behind her, "Miss Drummond." She turned. He said, "How long has your family been on that land?" She said, "My great-great-grandfather broke the ground in 1908. The house was built in 1911. He looked at the crate of notebooks. He said, "Your grandfather started writing in 1971. He said the land was telling him things and he wanted to make sure somebody wrote it down." Alderman was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was right to. She went out to where her father was waiting. The second meeting was held in January, 3 weeks into the new year, on a morning when the temperature was 9 degrees and the valley was locked under a sky the color of old pewter that had been there since Christmas and showed no signs of leaving. The parking lot had more vehicles this time, including the rental sedan again, and a truck she did not recognize from a hydrogeological consulting firm out of Missoula that Alderman had retained to begin the aquifer study. Alderman had called Roy the week before and asked if they would come in to assist with the revised site planning. Not just the channel, he said, everything. The drainage patterns, the frost pockets, the places that held water in August when the rest of the ground was dry. He said they were starting over on the site plan, and they wanted to understand the land before they drew anything new on it. Roy had looked at Cassie when he got off the phone. She had said yes before he could ask. They sat at the same long table. Patterson was not there this time. It was Alderman and 2 planners from the bank's development team and the hydrogeologist from Missoula. A woman in her 40s named Dr. Sandra Webb and Nora Tesh, who had driven up from Billings and who shook Cassie's hand when she came in and held it for a moment, and did not say anything but did not need to. Alderman spread the new base map on the table. It was the full 5,000 acres of the Puit parcel, with the topography rendered in fine contour lines and the existing construction footprint marked in red, where it sat stranded on the bottom land, the problem they were now working around. He said, "We want to start from what you know." Cassie opened her notebook. She had prepared for this. She had spent 3 evenings the previous week going through all 53 of her grandfather's volumes and her own 6 and making a second document longer than the first. Not just the channel entries, but everything the frost pockets in the North Meadow, where late planting never paid the 2 draws on the upper bench where water ran in wet years and created unstable soil for several seasons after the ridgeline, on the eastern boundary where the wind came through in a particular way in March that made any structure there vulnerable to uplift loading the low section along the western tree line, where the water table came within 4 feet of the surface, every April, without fail, and where any drainage installation would need to account for the annual pulse. She talked for an hour and 20 minutes. She talked the way her grandfather had written, without drama, without emphasis, just the observations and what they implied, and where in the record they could be found. Dr. Webb asked questions, and Cassie answered them in the short, precise sentences Earl Drummond had modeled across 53 volumes of notebooks. When Webb asked about the annual water table pulse in the western tree line, Cassie cited 4 specific entries across 3 decades that documented the depth and duration. When one of the planners asked about the frost pocket in the North Meadow, she opened the 1989 notebook and read the entry for May 3rd, a late freeze that had taken out the Puit family's alfalfa planting that year, and then the 1994 entry for the same date range, and then the 2011 entry, and the planner looked at the pattern and stopped arguing about whether the frost pocket was consistent enough to affect planning decisions. Alderman wrote things down. This was not something she had expected. He had a yellow legal pad, and he wrote on it in a compressed hand. Notes that were clearly going somewhere, not just the posture of listening. At one point, she identified a location on the upper bench, roughly 300 yards east of the original building site, where the ground was firm to depth, where the drainage ran naturally to the north away from the Drummond property, and where the rail spur geometry was still workable with a slight realignment of the approach grade. She had run the measurement from her notebook records and from the county parcel map. She put her finger on the base map at that point. She said, "This is where you build." Dr. Webb looked at it. She looked at her own data, the preliminary hydrogeological readings from the test wells that had been drilled the previous week. She said the preliminary readings were consistent with what Cassie was describing. She said she would need to complete the full analysis, but that the location looked viable from a subsurface standpoint. Alderman drew a circle on the base map at the point Cassie had indicated. When the meeting ended and they were putting on their coats, Nora Tesh came to stand beside Cassie at the door. She said, "In September, when I was walking that slab and looking at the northeast crack, I knew something was wrong with the survey. I went back to the core samples and I ran the historical data, and I found the channel. I documented everything and I submitted it, and it was taken out of the report, and I was told the variance was already approved. I want you to know that I argued against that. I was told the decision had been made at a level above mine." Cassie said, "I know. Thank you for keeping the original." Nora said, "I want you to know something else. When I found the channel in the data, I went and pulled the county soil survey from 1974. There was a note in the margin of the survey page for your section of the valley, handwritten in pencil. It said, 'C. Drummond for subsurface records, bottom pasture.'" Cassie was still. Nora said, "Somebody at the county level back in 1974 knew your grandfather had documentation and thought it was worth referencing in the official soil survey, in the margin, with his name." Cassie thought about her grandfather pressing his boot heel into the soft earth in May of 1971, writing it down, getting up, walking home, making supper, going to bed, and doing it again the next spring, and the spring after that, and the spring after that for 53 years, in the certainty that the writing mattered even when no one asked to read it. She said he always thought someone would need it eventually. Nora said he was right. The formal resolution came in February. The DEQ issued its remediation order. The water rights claim on Sorensen Creek was denied by the state engineer's office. Continental Trust withdrew the November contamination letter with a written statement acknowledging that the source of the aquifer disruption had been determined to be the Phase 1 construction activity on the Puit parcel, and that the Drummond property bore no responsibility for the condition. The settlement was finalized. The number was enough. It was enough to retire the loan in full with a margin remaining that Roy put in a reserve account and didn't touch. He sat at the kitchen table the morning the wire transfer confirmed and looked at the zero balance on the loan statement for a long time. He folded it and put it in the drawer where the notebooks were kept. He said 31,000 gone in one morning. She said 31,000 in 14 months. He looked at her. He said, "Yeah." They did not say anything else about it. In March, the county records office sent a formal notification. The hydrogeological study, now in its final drafting phase, had identified and named the subsurface feature that had been the subject of the entire preceding year. The feature would be recorded in the county's permanent geological records as the Drummond Paleo Channel in recognition of the prior documentation provided by the Drummond family, specifically the observational records compiled by Earl Drummond beginning in 1971 and continued by Cassie Drummond from 2018 to the present. Roy read the letter and set it on the table. He did not say anything. He went outside and stood on the porch for a while, the way he had stood on the porch in November with the contamination letter in his hands, but differently. The shape of it was different. She watched him through the window and she thought that he was probably thinking about his father, about a man who had gotten up every spring morning for 53 years and walked the land and written down what it was telling him, and who had died in the kitchen in the summer of 2022. Without ever knowing that someone would need it. She went out and stood beside him. The mist was moving out of the low places along the river bottom, the way it always did in early spring. Slow and deliberate, rolling out of the sloughs and the wet corners and the places where the water table came close to the surface. The same mist that had been there every spring morning since the river changed course and left its old bed buried under 30 feet of silt and gravel and memory. The cottonwood at the ford had put out its first tentative leaves, small and yellow-green, and the killdeer were back in their nesting place on the south bank, 20 yards closer to the water than they had been last year. The spring was running clean. Roy looked at the river bottom. The Continental Truss building, the original one, was gone now. The slab broken up and hauled away in November, the ground still raw, where the excavation had been not yet healed, but no longer bleeding. In the spring it would green over. In a few years you would not be able to tell from any distance that anything had been built there. The ground would reclaim it, the way ground always reclaimed things that had been placed on it without permission. To the north, on the upper bench, the new framing was going up. It was in exactly the location Cassie had put her finger on the base map in January. The steel columns caught the morning light, and the work crew was already on site even at this hour, moving with the particular efficiency of a project that had learned from its predecessor what happened when you did not listen to the ground. Roy said your grandfather would have had something to say about all this. She said he would have said the land told us where to build, and we built somewhere else first, and then the land had to tell us again. Roy almost smiled. He said that sounds like him. She had the current notebook in her jacket pocket the way she always did. She took it out and wrote the date and the temperature and the level of the river, which was running at the 1973 mark this year. Normal, healthy, the cottonwood's notch sitting just at the surface of the flow, the way it was supposed to. She wrote about the killdeer and the mist distribution and the new leaves on the cottonwood. She wrote spring running clean. Channel still there where it has always been. Name in the county records now. She thought about what that meant. She thought about her grandfather's name written in the margin of the 1974 County Soil Survey in someone else's pencil. A small acknowledgement from a county surveyor who had understood that the Drummond family knew something worth knowing. Now the channel itself carried the name officially permanently in the geological record of the county and the state. 53 years of notebooks had traveled from a wooden crate in a barn loft to a notation in a federal hydrogeological study. And the distance between those two places was not as far as it might have seemed. She wrote one more line. 53 years is a long time to wait for someone to ask the right question. Grandpa waited his whole life. I don't think he minded. I think he believed the question would come. She closed the notebook and put it back in her jacket pocket. The mist was burning off now as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, and the valley was opening up in the way it opened every spring morning, the light coming in low and flat and gold across the hayfields and the river, and the long arc of the bottom where the buried channel ran unseen and unchanged. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the cottonwood belt. The construction crew on the upper bench had started their equipment, and the sound of it drifted down on the cold air, steady and purposeful. A project that knew where it was going. Roy went in to make breakfast. Cassie stayed on the porch. She stood there for a long time the way her grandfather had stood on this porch. The way she had watched him stand for as long as she could remember, still and attentive reading what the valley was telling him, in the particular language of mist and bird and water level, and the soft places where the ground gave more than it should. She had been learning that language her whole life. She had a long time left to practice it. The notebooks would keep. She would keep filling them the way Earl had filled his, one entry at a time, one spring morning at a time, for as long as the valley had things to say. And she was there to hear them, which she intended to be for a very long time. This was her ground. She knew where the water went. She knew where the channel ran, and where the frost pockets were, and where the earth went soft underfoot in May, and what it meant when the killdeer moved north along the bank. She knew what her grandfather had known, and she was adding to it. And someday someone else would sit in the loft with a crate of notebooks and read what she had written, and find in it something they needed. That was the whole of it. That was what the notebooks were for. The bank spent $21 million learning what a green spiral notebook already knew. The real cost was not the concrete they poured or the lawyers they retained or the slab they broke up and hauled away. The real cost was April, when a man with a business card and a folding table and 30 years of professional authority smiled at a 14-year-old girl and turned back to his plans without asking her a single question. That smile cost $21 million and a year of Roy Drummond's sleep, and a spring that ran contaminated for 4 months before anyone with power over the situation was willing to call it what it was. Some knowledge does not appear in surveys. It does not show up in a 12-foot test pit drilled on a grid that was drawn without consulting the ground. It lives in green spiral notebooks, in wooden crates, in barn lofts, written down by people who got up every morning and walked the land and believed that what they were seeing was worth recording, even when no one asked them to, even when no one seemed to be listening, even when the only audience was the land itself and the people who would come after. Earl Drummond had been right about everything that mattered. He had known it in 1971, and he had written it down. And he had gone on knowing it for 53 years. And now his name was on the county maps, attached to the feature he had first identified with a steel rod and a belt knife and a green spiral notebook. And that was not a small thing. That was not nothing. The hawk turned one more circle, and then folded and dropped into the cottonwood belt fast and certain, and the valley was quiet except for the creek and the far sound of the construction crew. And somewhere in the south pasture, the low movement of cattle finding their morning water at the spring, which was running clean and cold. The way it had always run, the way it would go on running, carrying the aquifer's slow memory down through the gravel and the silt and out into the light.